How's everyone tonight? Thank you so much for being here. Very special night at the Working Men's Institute. Tonight we have Ariannah Kubli. She's the 2022 winner of the Arlene Feiner Memorial Research Grant for Women's Studies. Tonight we're very fortunate to have the 21 winner, Karen Moser, in the audience tonight. Karen. And of several members of the selection committee. We have Jeannie Maudlin in attendance. We have Linda Warren in attendance, and Melora Adams, our very own collections manager here at the Working Men's Institute. Not here tonight, Connie Weinzappel, Professor Annette Parks, formerly of the University of Evansville, and Professor Jen Horn of the University of Southern Indiana. Ariannah is a PhD student and teaching fellow at the Department of English and Comparative Literature at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Tonight she presents Women Reading in the Margins, Lives Tucked Between the Pages in the WMI Archives. Her research is focused specifically on looking at the marginalia written by the women who own some of the volumes in our collection. Ariannah's presentation will explore these stories of these New Harmony women through the traces that they left in their books. She hopes that by drawing attention to women's readers' engagement with literature, we can gain a new appreciation for the significance of literature in women's lives, while also rediscovering the stories of women who called New Harmony their home throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries. So without further ado, please welcome Ariannah Kubli.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for welcoming me to New Harmony and to the Working Men's Institute. Before I begin my presentation, I'd like to express my gratitude to the Arlene Feiner Grant Selection Committee and to the Friends of the Working Men's Institute. I am grateful for their support, which has allowed me to complete this project. I'd also like to thank Working Men's Institute Executive Director Ryan Rokicki and Collections Manager Melora Adams for their assistance with the logistics of my visit to New Harmony last spring. Now, I'll begin my presentation officially with a question for you all. Have you ever written in a book? Or maybe you've underlined a passage, maybe you left something in a book, maybe a receipt that you used as a bookmark. And if so, why? And can we share some of those stories? Yes?
I write little things in the side of the book for just so I know where to look for the paragraph that I want to tell my friends about.
Yeah.
To sort of wrap up the book and get them to want to read it.
Yeah, definitely. So notes to ourselves so that we know where to look for those really appealing passages that'll get our friends to read the book and then enjoy it with us. Absolutely, yes.
I write in my cookbooks because I want those stories to go to my children. So I'm writing in the cookbooks.
Yeah, absolutely. So that is a way, generation after generation, for families to remember stories and remember the food that gathered people together. Great, yeah.
I always write in a book when I gift it to someone, so that as a keepsake, a memorabilia. And if they haven't written in a book that they give me, I either ask them to pen it or I would do so.
Absolutely, great. So also as a way to remember, that you gave something to someone or that someone gave something to you. So as a way to trace relationships and the way that those relationships are, demonstrated through gift giving. Great.
I write in the margins of my Bible, mostly about my family and my thoughts. Try to pass on some ideas and thoughts that I have in my family when I'm gone. They'll have my Bible to be able to read.
Yeah, definitely, and that's something that goes, has a long, long tradition, right? Like a biblical hermeneutics and trying to read the Bible and understand what it means to you, and then leaving those marks for the future, so that what that means to you can be passed on. And I saw another.
Well, when I write in the marginalia, usually I just underline things that I want to remember and then make a mark in the margin. But sometimes what I do is write, what? What the heck? I mean, that kind of thing. But a friend of mine
copy of something like The Great Gatsby, and you see, from maybe the student who read that book for a class, those what the heck, Gatsby type of, comments in the margins. Reacting very directly in a very, kind of visceral way, like what are these characters doing? Why are they doing this? Absolutely, but then on the other side, also engaging with it maybe in a more serious way of writing about things that you're considering as you're reading. And then underlining too is super important, and something that we'll see tonight, because when you read a book, there's so many words. How are you going to remember what really spoke to you? How are you really going to remember that this particular passage is something that you want to take with you into the future? So, yes.
I had the opportunity to write my mother's story. I did that over several years, and I completed that about a year ago, and just trying to capture that. She's in her late 80s, and we took it from her childhood forward.
Yeah, wow. Great. So then sometimes, writing in books can also be writing a book, writing somebody's story down, and that gives the future something to remember of that person, and also the person that wrote that story. Great. I saw another hand. Yes.
Have you ever written in a book? In law school, that's all I did, was write in a book.
Yeah, definitely.
To translate the case that I was trying to understand.
Yeah, so in academic settings, absolutely, especially in higher education, when you're reading something really dense, like a case, like a law textbook, you need to make these notes to yourself, or else you'll go back to it the next morning after your all night reading of this textbook, and you won't remember what any of this meant. You go through and you make sure that you understand it. You want to remember that the next day or the next week or the next year. Wonderful. Thank you so much. So this practice of annotation, which we all just discussed, is something that we clearly still participate in today. It's something that we're going to talk about tonight in the context of 19th and 20th century books in the archives here at the Working Men's Institute, but it's also something that we do in the 21st century. Now, this practice of annotation reminds us that the books that we read aren't just these texts written by an author, stories that exist immaterially out in some sort of intellectual ether out in the universe. It's this story out there. No, books are material objects, and they're material objects that are read by people that live in the world, people with jobs, people with responsibilities, people with family connections, people with, exams, the next day. And so often, though, we forget about that. When we think about books, we think only about the text that's printed on the page. So from this perspective, each printed copy becomes more or less the same. So a Penguin Classics edition of a novel like Pride and Prejudice becomes indistinguishable from an online archives edition or a late 19th century printing or even an ebook, as long as the story begins by affirming that it is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife, and then ends with the marriage of Darcy and Elizabeth, we see ourselves as reading the same book. And undoubtedly, we are reading the story that Austen wrote, no matter which copy we're reading it from. But if we shift our attention while we're reading, if we look around the text, we might notice that these different copies of the same book, in fact, offer us something beyond Elizabeth Bennet's story. When we look around the text, at the notes that someone else wrote in the margins of a particular copy, at the items that they left between the pages, and the passages that they felt moved to underline, we encounter other readers of that book. As scholar Andrew M. Stauffer has written, marginalia and inscriptions transform the codex from a container of verbal content into a memorial, a time capsule, or a message in a bottle. So one day, the notes that you leave in your book, whether that's a cookbook or a textbook or a Bible, they could tell a future reader, like we just discussed, something about you and give them even a different perspective on the book itself. So by underlining a passage in a book that we find meaningful, it's like we're leaving a little metaphorical finger pointed towards that particular passage, that particular idea. And that mark, that little finger pointing to that passage, will draw the attention of a future reader. And that will affect their reception of the text. Because if anyone here, has anyone encountered a book like this before where there's writing in it? Yeah, and it affects how you read it, right? It draws your eye to that particular sentence. And those are little pieces of that previous reader left behind in the book. We're encountering these other readers through the marks that they're leaving for us. So these little pieces of people left behind in books are the subject of my presentation this evening. I came to New Harmony in March, interested in searching the WMI's archives for these remnants of early readers. As the only surviving Working Men's Institute, the collection here intrigued me because of its potential to reveal the ways that working class readers engaged with the books they read, particularly books written by women. When I began my work in the archive, I discovered two things. Firstly, and unfortunately for my original research proposal, WMI patrons over the last 200 or so years have actually quite fastidiously heeded the typical prohibition against writing in library books. But fortunately, this doesn't mean that there wasn't anything at all to find in the margins of these books. Many books in the archives here do include marginalia, underlining, and insertions, but nearly all the markings that I found came from books with names inscribed in the front covers, which tells us that the readers who wrote in these books were the book's original owners rather than library patrons. The second thing that I discovered on my trip to New Harmony in March was this. Many of the original owners who wrote in these books were women. And this gendered distribution shouldn't come as a huge surprise. Scholars have found that 90% of white Americans, both men and women, were literate by the mid-19th century. And since the late 19th century, women have consistently read more fiction than men. So the markings in the books in the WMI archives represent the engagement of the many women who owned, read, and eventually donated these volumes, or eventually their descendants donated these volumes. And this evening, we are going to meet some of these women readers through the pages of their books in the WMI. On one of my first days in New Harmony last spring, I found a particularly fascinating insertion in an 1836 volume. Titled Forget Me Not, A Christmas, New Year's, and Birthday Present, this book belongs to a series of annual gift anthologies published by Ackerman & Co., a London-based publishing company, between 1823 and 1847. As I flipped through the pages of this 1836 edition, a thick, brown lock of hair revealed itself. Nothing else in the volume offered an explanation for this lock of hair. Unlike some other books, which include copious notes that perhaps could have shed some light on the meaning of the hair or the owner of the hair, the only thing written in this volume was a name inscribed on the inside cover. Cecilia Fredigeau. Fredigeau is certainly a recognizable name in New Harmony, right? I know some folks back there know Frédégot. We've got Madame Marie Duclos Frédégot, who was a disciple of educational reformer Pestalozzi, and she was a major figure in Robert Owen's utopian experiment in New Harmony in the 1820s. And she was only in New Harmony briefly, but after she left New Harmony, her son, Achilles Emery Frédégot, remained, as did many of his descendants, including Nora Chadwick Frédégot, who served for many years as the librarian of the WMI. And the many boxes of the family's documents housed in the archives are a testament to the influence the Frédégots historically exerted in the town. But among the many files dedicated to all the other Frédégots, very little information about Cecilia is included. On the Frédégot family tree in the archive, one of many of the family trees, she's listed as the first wife of Madame Frédégot's son, Achilles Emery Frédégot, with a birth year of 1822, marriage year of 1839, and death year of 1853. Other than this, the only document dedicated to her in the archive is a calling card with her name printed in a small cursive font. So, of course, my curiosity was piqued, and I looked to published sources for more information. And I found that a young Cecilia arrived in New Harmony under the care of Charles Alexander Lesueur in 1826, aboard the same boat that brought Madame Frédégot, William McClure, and others, so called the Boatload of Knowledge. Another source elaborates slightly, explaining that another member of Lesueur's family was Cecilia Noel, whose fever-stricken parents in Santo Domingo had entrusted her to the kind-hearted Lesueur, who brought her to New Harmony, where she afterwards married Achilles Emery Frédégot, son of Madame Frédégot. The pieces of Cecilia's early life were now starting to come into focus, but the lock of hair in the book remained a mystery. Returning to the archives, I began finding out more about Cecilia beyond her position as Lesueur's ward by looking to the boxes of her male relatives' documents. In a letter from John Poole to her husband, Achilles Emery Frédégot, dated March 27, 1839, the year of the marriage of Achilles and Cecilia, John writes, "Dear friend, the first thing I have to do this morning is to wish you much joy, and it is with pleasure I do so, for among all my female acquaintances, I have never come across the one I thought as much of as I did of Cecilia." This high praise suggests Cecilia must have been an accomplished woman, despite her difficult start in life. Still, I hoped to find more information. Finally, in her son's autobiographical writings, I found a more thorough account of Cecilia's life, death, and her character. Achilles Henry Frédégot's memoir, written in the late 1890s, not long before his death in 1906, confirms the story of Cecilia's orphanhood, first of all, and then later he shares a sweet anecdote that provides us with a window into his mother's character. In it, Cecilia sends her son to the store for cinnamon, and when he repeatedly comes home, time and again, with the wrong spice, I think it's first he comes home with salt, and then he comes home with maybe clove, something like that. He recalls that, quote, "Mother laughed at her boy, took a little piece of paper, wrote cinnamon, and I got it that time." Rather than anger, Cecilia shows good-natured mirth at her young son's mistake. A few pages thereafter in the memoir, Achilles shares the family tragedy that he believes caused his mother's early death. In May of 1852, Achilles went swimming in the Wabash River with his brothers Alex and Eugene. Strong currents caused Eugene to lose his balance, And despite the efforts of brothers and the help of onlookers, Eugene drowned, and Alex nearly did too. When Achilles brings the news home to his mother, who had only just given birth to daughter Mary the previous day, she runs to the river, and Achilles writes, she had to be, quote, carried home by father almost dead. He continues, this dreadful calamity caused mother's death in the next year. In a short time, dear father had 3 funerals. Eugene, May 24th of 1852. Mother died July 16th, 1853, only 30 years old. Then baby sister Mary, August 5th, 1853. Our mother's death almost killed us all. Poor father would let us crawl into his arms and cry until our hearts would almost break. With this story in mind, let's return to the lock of hair found in the Forget-Me-Not volume. Although today we might see this lock of hair from someone long deceased as maybe unsanitary or even a little spooky, in the mid-19th century, saving such mementos from the bodies of loved ones was a common practice. As historian Helen Schumacher writes, for 18th and 19th century white, usually middle-class Americans, hair work was figuratively love entwined. She explains that bereaved friends and family members of the deceased would often cut a lock of hair from the body as a way to feel closer to the departed. The griever could then save the lock of hair, they might save it in a book, they might turn it into jewelry or art even. And Victorian literature scholar Deborah Lutz elaborates on this trend, connecting mid-19th century hair work to the holy relics of the Catholic Church, material objects meant to bring devotees closer to a particular holy figure, often a saint. Lutz explains that originally all relics were holy, but as Protestantism spread in the 16th and 17th centuries, secular relics from deceased loved ones began to replace holy relics from saints. The lock of hair we see in Cecilia Fredijo's book is, I want to suggest, an example of a secular relic. After the early death of this beloved mother, one of her children may have transformed this book, fittingly titled Forget-Me-Not, into a repository for this material remembrance of Cecilia. And another book in the WMI's archive actually offers some really fascinating support for this hypothesis. In Rollo's Tour of Europe, a book belonging to Achilles Henry Fredijo, the young Achilles who wrote the memoir later in life, has inserted flower petals between the pages. Petals on pages that look remarkably similar to the petals inserted in his mother's book. And we see here the flower petals in his book and the flower petals in his mother's book. Perhaps after his mother's death, Achilles Henry consoled himself by reading her books and chose this one to house this remembrance of his mother. Deborah Lutz writes that relics of individuals, rather than saints or celebrities, had value only to a handful of people, or even to just one. And if that one died, then the relic became an unmarked grave of worth to no one. By putting the pieces of Cecilia Fredijo's story back together, we return meaning to this material remembrance of the life of a wife, mother, and reader in mid-19th century New Harmony. My next story from the archive centers on an example of another reading-related practice common in the 19th century. In the section of the archive that holds school books, plenty of books, unsurprisingly, include underlining and notes, just like we talked about often. Academic books will have, some marks in them. But one of these books, a McGuffey's Fourth Eclectic Reader, boasts some particularly fun messages from its original owner. Dated January 28, 1881, and inscribed Miss Annie Service, Bloomington, Indiana, the owner of this book, Miss Annie, very clearly wants us to keep out. In multiple places on the first few pages of her McGuffey's Reader, Annie has occupied herself, whether in class or not, we don't know, by writing some poems of warning to us. The first, written opposite her name and the date, reads, "Steal not, my little one, or you will be shunned by everyone, and feel and look like the little fish hung on the hook." But Annie doesn't stop there. As if the threat of fish-inspired ostracization ultimately doesn't feel intimidating enough, she ups the ante on the next page. "Steal not this book, for if you do, you will feel the weight of my old shoe." Now resorting to threats of violence, Annie doodles a frame around her message for added emphasis. But Annie is apparently still unconvinced that assault via old shoe will guarantee the safety of her McGuffey's Fourth Eclectic Reader. No, now Annie, in her final poem, promises much worse than the weight of her old shoe. She writes, "Steal not this book for fear of shame, for in it stands the owner's name. Steal not this book, my honest friend, for fear of the gallows will be your end. Up the ladder and down the rope, and there you'll hang until you'll choke." So, I, for one, have no intention of stealing Annie's book after reading that. Now, at the time that Annie wrote these poems, such messages in the opening pages of books, especially books owned by children, weren't uncommon. Scholar Lauren Alex O'Hagan explains that these messages, called book curses, began in the Middle Ages, before the invention of the printing press, when books were particularly rare and expensive. As books became less rare over time, especially in the 19th century with advancements in printing and papermaking, book curses morphed into the tradition of decorative book plates, a printed label with the owner's name. And often, in the case of children's books, the practice even continued as versified warnings against theft, such as those we see in Annie's McGuffey's Reader. Scholar Patricia Crane elaborates on this trend in her book titled Reading Children, Literacy, Property, and the Dilemmas of Childhood in 19th Century America, in which she provides numerous examples of ownership curses in children's books during the 19th century, and demonstrates that these curses served as introductions to private property and to contractual obligation for the children. The recognizable form of the book curse also, she explains, indicated membership in what she calls school child culture. We see the most recognizable of these forms in the last of Annie's poems. "Steal not this book, my honest friend, for fear the gallows will be your end," as well as "Steal not this book for fear of shame, for in it you see the owner's name." Both of these are common refrains in these curses. But Miss Annie Service goes beyond those typical lines, showing the potential thief that if they steal her book, they face some particularly unique perils, like the slap of an old shoe, or a shame comparable to that of a caught fish. These verses in Annie's McGuffey's Reader are not just examples of a 19th century schoolchild practice. They're also evidence of a specific girl's creative mind, evidence that's available to us only through this one copy of an old school book. As Crane writes, in the variety of marks left in children's books, children in the past come alive as historical actors, inhabiting and transforming long-lived forms of children's culture. Although McGuffey's Readers were and remain fairly common books, more than about 100 million copies of the Readers were reputedly sold by the end of the 19th century. Only this individual copy brings us into contact with Miss Annie Service and her imaginative, somewhat dark, but eccentrically charming poems. Our next story from the archive also begins with girlhood, but this time we'll have the privilege of witnessing a girl's growth into a woman. As I combed through the archives in March, looking for markings and other remnants, I noticed the frequent repetition of particular names in the book's inscriptions, either family names or individuals' names. Of course, names from some of the major families in New Harmony's history were common, such as Fredigeau and Owen, but one particular family caught my attention, both for its novelty — it was not for once a Fredigeau or an Owen — and for the fact that the individuals named in the inscriptions were almost always women. And that is how I met two sisters, Elsie Wilhelm and her older sister, Meta Wilhelm. Most of the volumes belonging to the sisters are inscribed with Elsie's name, though some of them include the names of both sisters, and a few belonged solely to Meta. The archives holds about a dozen books once owned by these sisters, spanning 1890 through 1915. The books from the early years of this period indicate that Elsie and Meta's parents encouraged their daughters to appreciate books and reading. In a copy of Little Rosebud, a children's book by British writer, college woman, and lifelong suffragist Beatrice Harraden, we find the inscription, Miss Elsie Wilhelm from Mama and Papa. Similarly, the inscription in a copy of Black Beauty reads, To Meta from Mama and Papa, Christmas 1900. And on page 67 of this book, we see a gift tag in the shape of a young girl that says, For Elsie from Meta. This tag might suggest that Meta regifted Black Beauty to Elsie, or perhaps Elsie was reading her older sister's book and used a gift tag as a bookmark during the Christmas season. Regardless, these books point to the significance of reading in the sisters' young lives. Their parents gifted them books, thereby conferring importance on those books. And then the girls likely read each other's books, finding common ground in the stories that they enjoyed. Another volume in the archive suggests that Mr. and Mrs. Wilhelm began encouraging a love of books in their daughters, perhaps even before the girls could read. In Baby Lay's first book for the little ones, some young hand has repeatedly marked the opening pages with her father's business stamp, John A. Wilhelm, dealer in staple and fancy groceries. This appears over and over again, as we see, as if a little girl, too young to actually write in the book herself, nonetheless wanted to demonstrate her possession of it. This book is mine. I am said baby. And so used her father's stamp for her own purposes. The clearly significant role of reading in the Wilhelm household exemplifies what scholar Barbara Sicherman calls the culture of reading during the late 19th century, which she defines as an environment or way of life that fostered intense engagement with literacy in its diverse forms. In Sicherman's study, Well-Read Lives, How Books Inspired a Generation of American Women, she argues that this culture of reading among American girls and young women bloomed during the Gilded Age and ultimately led to a generation of publicly engaged women during the Progressive Era. She writes that by the late 19th century, middle-class homes were suffused with literary activities, boisterous as well as meditative, collective as well as private. Parents, especially mothers, encouraged their children to value reading, and the Wilhelm household seems to have followed that pattern, with parents gifting books to their young daughters. We even see a love for reading proudly noted in the obituary of Elsie and Meta's mother, Annie M. Wilhelm, who died in 1937. Mrs. Wilhelm was a woman of superior intelligence and found much satisfaction in the companionship of books. From the first book for the little ones onward, Elsie and Meta clearly grew up in a home that encouraged them to explore and enjoy the world of literature. So, a few years later, where do we think Elsie and Meta ended up as young adults? Any guesses? School. We're getting close. We're getting close. Teaching. What about what comes before? College. Yes, exactly. So, Elsie and Meta went to college. New Harmony High School alumni records tell us that Meta graduated from NHHS in 1905 and Elsie in 1912. The sisters' books themselves then reveal that Meta was a student at Indiana University by 1906 and Elsie by 1913. In this period, college education for women certainly wasn't unheard of, but it also wasn't yet as common as it is today. Historian Barbara Miller Solomon explains that between 1860 and 1920, going to college became an accepted part of growing up for women in certain social groups, particularly in middle-class families, but the percentage of women who attended college during this period still remained relatively low. In 1910, only 3.8% of 18 to 21-year-old women were college women. In 1920, that percentage had increased to 7.6%. But by comparison, the college enrollment rate of women aged 18 to 24 years old in 2021 is 43%. Elsie and Meta, both students at Indiana University in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, belonged to this period's small but growing cohort of college women. Given the low enrollment of women in universities during these years, the sisters wouldn't have only found themselves included in a college-educated minority among women of their age in the U.S. They also would have been part of a minority of the student body at Indiana University. Indiana University was one of the first 8 public universities in the U.S. to admit women, a policy it adopted in 1869. But men still outnumbered women well into the 20th century. This fact would have impacted Elsie and Meta's experience of college, as would have the additional rules and restrictions faced by women students at IU and other colleges during the period. For example, an online IU library exhibition notes that in the 1890s, so only a few years before Meta matriculated around 1906, college authorities only allowed women to socialize on particular nights of the week and at particular times. But despite their minority status at the university and the watchful administrative eye that undoubtedly regulated their conduct, the notes in the sisters' college books suggest that they didn't let these challenges distract them from fully dedicating themselves to their studies. The sisters' college books constitute the majority of their representation in the archive. These are just a handful here. From Jane Austen to Ralph Waldo Emerson, the sisters clearly took their love of reading with them to the university. Like many colleges during the early 20th century, Indiana University structured its undergraduate curriculum during this period mostly through an elective system, where students selected classes based on personal or professional interests. And they did this rather than follow a very kind of strict required set of courses like most universities have today. You have your core curriculum. So Elsie and Meta likely encountered these books up on the screen in classes that they chose to take. They selected these classes. They wanted to engage with these texts. The books I encountered in the archive suggests the sisters took courses focused on English novelists and on American and English essayists, subjects that feel like a natural development in the intellectual interests of young women who grew up reading Beatrice Harraden and Anna Sewell. Elsie and Meta didn't just purchase and read these volumes for their classes, though. They didn't read it and then throw it to the side. They also actively engaged with these texts through ample annotation in the margins, as well as underlining and bracketing passages of particular importance and/or interest, just like we do today still. Meta and Elsie's books often include class notes even, and reminders about readings due by the next class period. And these are marks, I would say, of a serious student. They're really paying attention to what's happening in class. They're keeping on top of their assignments. These extra textual notes also give us hints even of the books that they read in the classes that didn't make it into the WMI's collection. So books like things by George Eliot, Maria Edgeworth, and Daniel Defoe are represented in these notes. And we don't have those books in the archive, but because they're listed here, I think that we can assume that they probably read those too. These were probably books that they also read for these classes. And Meta's notes, especially her notes in Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, also include, interestingly, a list of major writers, both English and American, with their birth year, death year, and the year of their first published novel. This gives us a hint of what she would have been studying in class, and also, again, shows us how meticulous she was with her note-taking. This is a very thorough list here and very nicely organized. And on another page, she even outlines the squabble between 18th century writers Samuel Richardson and Henry Fielding, the latter of whom infamously parodied the former's novel Pamela with his own novel titled Shamala, which is a fun rabbit hole down literary history if anyone is interested. And Meta's notes in this volume also share some of her thoughts about Austen's novel itself. She writes that Austen possesses the keenest and most subtle humor. She also has a particular fondness for the characters in Austen. She describes them as real and very interesting. She calls them lifelike, and she offers some insight on the reason for the richness of these characters. As we see here, she says Austen never described any character with whom she did not sympathize. This reading of Austen could perhaps influence our understanding of characters in the novel, especially characters like the buffoonish Mr. Collins and the vain Lady Catherine. So next time we read Pride and Prejudice, we can look for this sympathy that Meta identifies in Austen's depiction of all of her characters. And maybe we'll see these characters from a different perspective. On the whole, these copious notes in Meta's book paint a picture of a studious reader, one who paid careful attention to lectures and who found the courses that she took interesting enough to thoroughly record the content, while also offering, at the same time, some astute commentary on the novel itself. Inscriptions and notes inside the Wilhelm sisters' college books also hint at the personality and experiences of younger sister Elsie. In each of these books, we find an inscription that includes a sister's name, the university's name, a date, and sometimes the name of a dormitory. The inscription in Elsie's copy of Charles Lamb's Essays of Elia is particularly revealing. In it, Elsie has also listed the name of her roommate, Julia Ritchie, pictured to the right up here, in the inscription, along with their dormitory room number. So we know that in 1913, Elsie roomed with another girl at the university, and they shared this volume, perhaps indicating that Julia took this class on English essayists as well. Another page of front matter in the same volume gives us a further taste of Elsie's on-campus social life. Here, we see the names and hometowns of multiple girls, presumably fellow students at the university, maybe even the other students who were living on the hallway of this dormitory near Julia and Elsie. This evidence of camaraderie suggests that Elsie made plenty of friends during her college years. We also find something fun stuck between the pages of Elsie's copy of Thomas Carlyle's Past and Present. A doodle labeled Little Elsie, drawn on a torn piece of brown paper. I appreciate the resonances of this quick drawing. After growing up in a book-loving household, Elsie, now a college student, reminisces on this girlhood that started her on her path to higher education, and she uses that doodle as, fittingly, a bookmark. Of course, we shouldn't think that Elsie's social life and her doodling deterred her from completing her coursework. In each of her books, she leaves notes in the margins commenting on the material she reads. In one particularly amusing comment in her collection of Emerson's essays, she notes with what I read as a slightly disappointed tone that Emerson did not have Carlyle's sense of humor. Like, I'm sorry, Elsie, you just gotta keep reading it. You just gotta keep reading. She also comments on the characters she encounters in these texts. In the back of W.M. Thackeray's The Newcomes, for example, she calls Colonel Newcome a charming old man, but laments the severity of his personality and his propensity to overindulging in alcohol. Her books also include ample annotations and underlines, and there in fact seems to be a theme to some of these moments of engagement with the text that we're about to look at. On a page of Emerson's essay, Spiritual Laws, on the left on the screen, she underlines the claim that, quote, each man has his own vocation. The talent is the call. And in the margins writes, don't choose, drift into it. And on the first page of Labor, one of Thomas Carlyle's essays included in her collection of his work, she underlined the sentence, for there is a perennial nobleness and even sacredness in work. And then brackets Carlyle's reassurance that, quote, there is always hope in a man that actually and earnestly works. In idleness alone is there perpetual despair. Like many college students, both then and now, Elsie seems to have been concerned with the path she would take after graduation. How, she wondered, would she put her education to use in the working world? And we've had some folks already guess it, school teaching. Although our access to Elsie and Metta's books end after their college years, records of other types answer this question for us. What were they going to do? And as I said, both sisters became lifelong educators, and they both became lifelong educators at the high school level, actually. Older sister Metta Wilhelm taught Latin for many years at Whiting High School before eventually attending Columbia University for further education, and later teaching in schools not just in Indiana, but in South Dakota and Minnesota. Meanwhile, Elsie Wilhelm began teaching mathematics at Greencastle High School in 1921. She then married local dentist Ralph J. Overstreet in 1922, and she continued teaching as Mrs. Elsie Overstreet at Greencastle High until 1926. In 1927, she and her husband actually divorced. They divorced, and by 1930, we see her on the faculty pages of the New Harmony High School yearbook, where she continued teaching till her retirement in 1959. And according to the NHHS yearbooks in the WMI Archives, Elsie, like her sister, returned to college later in her career to further her education. By the year of her retirement, we see that the faculty page notes that in addition to her bachelor's degree in mathematics from Indiana University, she also studied library science at Columbia University, Chicago University, and Wisconsin University. Metta and Elsie's choice to teach wasn't an unusual one for college-educated women at the beginning of the 20th century. Teaching was a popular option for many reasons, including the stability of the profession, the high demand for teachers, and the opportunities it afforded for continued engagement with academic subjects, the type of subjects that these new teachers would have been interested in during college. In one study conducted in 1915, 83.5% of a sample of employed college-educated women were teachers. The gender divide in the teaching profession during the period reflects this preference. Research conducted by historian Geraldine J. Clifford tells us that in 1921, 83.7% of K-12 teachers in the U.S. were women. And in 1920, 65% of high school teachers in the U.S. were women. Elsie's choice to continue teaching while married, on the other hand, is more exceptional, and I believe that it demonstrates her strong commitment to her profession. In 1930, a whole 80% of U.S. women teachers were single, so only 20% were married. And as a dentist, Ralph, Elsie's husband, certainly could have afforded to support his wife, so her continued employment as a teacher during the years of her marriage doesn't seem to have been driven by financial necessity. No. As Emerson writes in the passage that Elsie underlined in her college book, each man, or in this case woman, has his or her own vocation. The talent is the call. Elsie must have felt that she found her vocation, her calling, in teaching. And her students seem to have appreciated her talent. In 1960, the year after her retirement, the students of New Harmony High School dedicated their yearbook to her. And this wasn't the first time that she had been honored with the dedication. A quarter of a century earlier, in 1934, another generation of New Harmony students dedicated their yearbook to their mathematics teacher, Mrs. Elsie Overstreet, who contributed so much to our school day lives. In each of the examples that we've explored this evening, the annotations, inscriptions, and insertions in the books in the archive have served as keys to unlocking details of women's lives long ago completed. Paying attention to these extra textual elements that we might typically overlook has brought us closer to the original readers of these books, reminding us that the writer is only one half of the equation of literature. From a loving mother gone too soon, to a creative schoolgirl poetess, to college-educated sisters who found fulfillment through teaching, the archives of the WMI hold stories of readers just as rich as those found in the writings of its book's authors. These case studies honor the lives of the women who owned, read, and loved their books, while also demonstrating the irreplaceability of these particular copies. In the words of Andrew Stauffer, marked copies elevate the individual, the specimen, the example, and the case. They counter the views of copies as duplicates and lives as reducible to the mass data of demography. I hope that tonight we've reminded ourselves of the importance of books as material objects, the importance of books as they're found in libraries, in archives, and on our own shelves. I also hope that you've enjoyed learning from and about these local women who lived, worked, studied, and read in New Harmony so many years ago. So now, to conclude our time together, I'd love to hear if anything from tonight's presentation struck a chord with you. Did anything feel relevant to your own reading practices? Did any of these women's stories really resonate? Do you have any stories about books that you would like to share? Maybe family heirlooms, things like that. I would love to open up the discussion now to hear from you all and see what you all think about what we've explored tonight. Yes.
I never considered consider that.
Thank you.
Great, yes, absolutely. I do think it's fascinating. I mean, sometimes we sit and we read books and we think, oh, if only I could write a book. Well, even if you write a book, what's that book without the person that reads it? Right? Great. What else? What else would you like to share? Yeah.
It just strikes me that a lock of hair or a flower petal can sit in a volume like that and open shelving.
It's in the archives, but yeah, it's still
for
sitting on the
150
shelves.
years.
Mm-hmm.
It's still there. You know? How much more is up there?
That's a great question. There's definitely a lot that I found that I didn't even touch on tonight. A lot more stories that need to be explored. And this is just one. This is one really fantastic archive here, but there are archives and libraries all over the country where there are all of these interesting notes and insertions. This fellow, Andrew Stouffer, is a scholar at the University of Virginia, and he actually started an online digital repository for for notes that people find in the margins of actually college library books. And so you can check that out online too, and that's just libraries from universities. And then there's always public libraries, there are private libraries. There's a lot out there, and I think it's really fascinating. Yes?
Ariannah, how did you start your search? Like, how did you go back into the archives and look at the works of fiction particularly, and then just, I mean, how did you find Cecilia? How did you find them?
Yeah, it was a lot of taking a book off of the shelf, opening it up. Is there anything in there? Nope. Okay, putting it back on the shelf. But yes, I did start with fiction because a lot of the time, I started with fiction and poetry because often that can be what resonates with people as they read it, rather than maybe like a geography book. You might not feel moved to underline something there. Maybe if we're going on a trip. But I figured you have to start somewhere, so I started there, and then I just worked my way around. I found, like I said, that the children's books were really rich with notes. I actually found something that didn't make it into the presentation was a book that belonged to Nora Chadwick Fredigeau when she was a child, who was the librarian here at the WMI for many years. And there was a note stuck into that book that was from a teacher that said, "Miss Chadwick, please turn in your assignment as soon as possible." So, which was fun, a fun reminder that everyone is a child at some point, even if they become a really well-known community member. But yeah, yes.
Did anything surprise you?
Anything? I mean, first of all, the hair was not something I expected to find, especially the thickness of it. It's not a little lock. It's not a little lock. It's a chunk. So I was surprised, like this gentleman said, that stayed in there for so long. That it was there and it was in pristine condition.
When are the DNA results coming in?
Yeah, we wish. Yes, I see a hand.
Well, I think it would be interesting for everybody to know that you spent a lot of time back there. And there were times that we went back and checked on you because you had a good time.
Yeah, I'm glad that I had made my trip a week because every day I was in there from morning till close to closing time. It's got a little chilly sometimes because it's kept nice and cold back there, but it was good because it kept me awake. And I found a lot of great interesting stories through all of that searching. So I'm glad that I did it. Yes.
I wonder what you think about the effect of e-books on this in the future.
Yeah.
There's no way to make comments, I don't think.
I'll just say right now, I felt the same way. My son got the ebook, but you can highlight, and then like a slang kind of word or something, you can highlight it. I don't know, and you can see that people highlighted that before too. I don't know, I find it so fascinating. I didn't think I would enjoy the ebook so much, but that really has helped with enjoyment, I think, the highlighting and things like that, and it really makes me think about that.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think that's an interesting and important question, and that's also a really interesting contribution, because that's not even something that I knew about. I didn't realize that there were certain ebook softwares where you could see what other people highlighted, but I think that could be another really rich field for research, a sort of 21st century technologically advanced version of what we're doing here. Though at the same time, I do think that this sort of work emphasizes the importance of these physical copies, right? Because if it's, say, I don't know if y'all are familiar with Project Gutenberg,
Yeah.
but they put just the text of many classic works of literature available for free online. And it's a really great resource, and a lot of the time students use it, other folks use it as well. But when it's just the text it's white screen and black text, and that's it. And looking at these volumes, you see how much is lost on that sort of HTML based version of that story. You don't see what other people have connected with, though apparently there are these other softwares where you do. Though I wonder also about the transitoriness of them, like the permanency, like that sort of software.
Yeah.
10 years, the company goes out of business, and then what happens, or what sort of thing. Though I think it's still very interesting.
It's just not a Kindle paperweight. That's online.
Yeah.
But this is also struck at, because I have a lot of my dad's old quotes when he was a kid, and he wrote on them and drew pictures and stuff. And now I'm going to go back and look at them.
Yeah,
and see what I missed,
Absolutely. Yeah, I definitely encourage that. Yeah. Other folks, other comments or questions or things that resonated.
What is your next project?
My next project, getting the syllabus ready for the class I'm teaching in the fall. That will be my next project. Yes. Great. Well, thank you all so much.
I feel bad for not writing in my books now. I like to keep mine nice and pristine, as new as they came off the shelf at Barnes & Noble. My wife, on the other hand, she writes paragraphs in her books, so maybe she'll be the part of a study one day. What you have to look forward to next year is the Lena Feiner Grant. 2023 winners, Dr. Eleanor Rust and Dr. Trista Yeager, for their project Frances Wright, America's Forgotten Radical. They're going to do a podcast, so look forward to that. And we had so many great entries this year. We couldn't just pick one, so we have dual winners. The next one is Rebecca May Hope, Women of Paradise, Contributions to Female Boatloaders to New Harmony. So you have those programs to look forward to in the spring of summer of next year. Finally, we want to say thanks to the Efroymson Family Fund, made this night possible, and of course have Lena Feiner in our fond remembrances tonight. One more time for Ariannah.